Today, I'd like us to draw some lessons from the parable of the tenants as recorded in Matthew chapter 25 from verse 14 to 30. And the first lesson is that God has given us different gifts. These different gifts that God has given to us are for free. They are from Him, and we are to use them to His glory. The reality is that there is none of us that God has given nothing. In verse 14, while the master, prepares to leave, he calls his servants and entrusts his property to them. Verse 15 says, to one he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. It is important to realize that God hasn't given us all the same things. We are all created with different skills and abilities and opportunities. It is important to note that the gifts, the talents we have in life are blessings that God has entrusted to us. He gives different spiritual gifts, different resources, different backgrounds, different opportunities, different responsibilities to different people so that they can use these gifts and talents and abilities and blessings for the glory of His name. And regardless of your standing in this society, friend, I want you to remember that God has entrusted something to you. God has given you a gift. God has given you a talent. God has given you, specific blessings that He wants you to use to the glory of His name. The second lesson we draw from the parable of the tenant is that we should use our God-given talents to serve God and His people. In verse 16 all the way to verse 18, this is what the Bible says. The man who had received the 5 talents went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. So also the one with the 2 talents gained 2 more. But the man who had received the 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. And friend, I'd like to remind us that God has entrusted something to us. And some of the gifts, He has entrusted to us, include skills, abilities, family connections, social position, education, experience in different fields, and so on. God has entrusted something to us. But the question is, what are you doing with the gift? What are you doing with the talent that God has given you? Will you hide the talent? Will you use the talent, the gift that God has given to you? Will you misuse the gift? Will you abuse the gift? I put it to us that it is not acceptable to merely put those gifts on, a closet shelf somewhere and ignore them. God desires that we employ the gifts, the talents, the abilities He has given us in His service for His glory. God has given us different gifts. We should use those gifts to serve God and His people. And finally, God holds us accountable for how we live and use the gifts he has entrusted to us. You know, the master wanted to know what had been done with his possessions that he allowed others to manage. In verse 19, the Bible says, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. And from this verse, friends, we learn that God will hold us accountable for how we manage the gifts he has given us. God will hold us accountable and he will settle accounts with us. Let us look at the conversation that this master had with his servants. With the first two servants, both of them, took what the master gave them, used it and produced even more. When the master eventually returns, these faithful servants are praised, and they are entrusted with more of the master's wealth. Look at verse 21 and 23. Well done, good and faithful servants. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Well, you know what? Things did not go the same way with the third servant. And look at how the master responds to him in verse 26. His master replied, "You wicked, lazy servant." The other ones are being told, good and faithful servants. The third one who did not invest, who hid, "You wicked, lazy servant." And later in verse 30, he is referred to as worthless. So he is a wicked, lazy, worthless worker. This master in this parable is dead serious about holding his servants accountable. And you know what? God will hold us accountable for how we use those opportunities he has given us. God will hold you accountable for how you use and treat, the friends he has entrusted to us. He will hold us accountable for how we live and use the gifts he has entrusted to us. God will hold you accountable for how you use that car, he has given you. God will hold you accountable for how you run your home. Yes, one day we shall stand before our Creator and give account for how we lived and use the gifts he has entrusted to us. And my question is, what will the Lord say to you? Will he say, "Well done, good and faithful servant"? Or is he going to say, "You wicked, lazy, and worthless servant, get away from me"? Friends, what we hear from the master on that day will depend on how we live and how we put to use the gifts, the talents, the abilities he has entrusted to us.